Our speaker on the topic of the original Fighting Irish, Notre Dame's Civil War chaplains, is Father Robert Miller, who has specialized in the role of religion in the Civil War for years. He's a Catholic priest, former president of the Chicago Civil War Roundtable, a pastor on the Southside of Chicago, founder of a faith-based housing corporation, and the author of 6 books. His last book, which he has here on the podium, was Both Prayed to the Same God, Religion and Faith in the Civil War. Father Bob Miller.
Thank you, Doug. We've been called many things in my life. I don't think I've ever been called a guinea pig before, but we all are guinea pigs today, aren't we? Isn't it good to be here?
Yes.
My gosh, in a year and a half, we can all remember. I'm old enough to remember the day when Kennedy was shot. Remember those, some of you are my generation. And we ask you, where were you that day? You know, I think you can all remember, where were you before the COVID hit all of us? But anyway, it's good to be back, isn't it? Pleasure to be with you here today. And I too was a little bored over the time, so I had a chance to, you guys are going to benefit. I threw together a PowerPoint presentation for this talk, which I've given a number of times, but never had slides to go with it. And so if you get bored of me, just watch the screen, okay? So good to have you here today with us too. Start off with our opening scene here. The year was 1888. This man right here, Bishop John Ireland, one of America's most prominent Catholic bishops at the time, also a Civil War chaplain, by the way, 5th Minnesota, a legendary man. He was preaching in a brand new church in northern Indiana, and the pew nearby was occupied by an old priest who looked exactly like that. Look at that hair, that long hair, that long beard, tremendous white beard. His name was Father Edward Sorin, and he was celebrating his 50th anniversary of priesthood. And Archbishop Ireland, as some bishops want to do, is make the most of it. If you've ever been to a bishop's talk, you know they can kind of go on and on sometimes. So he's going, making the most of it, and people are nodding off a little bit, a typical Episcopal discourse. But suddenly, Sorin perked up when he heard Bishop Ireland say this. Quote, "It's a lamentable fact that few priests were sent to the Civil War front to minister to the soldiers. Father Sorin's community was weak in numbers. The absence of even one stopped important work at home, but he sent forward 7 to serve as chaplains. Father Sorin appealed to the Sisters of the Holy Cross, and they rushed southward to care for the wounded, to soothe the pillows of the dying. There were other priests and other sisters in the war, but none excelled those of the Holy Cross. In daring feat and a religious fervor, Father Sorin, you saved the honor of the church." So who was this man right here? Edward Sorin. Well, he was a member of a Catholic religious congregation founded in France, called the Congregation of the Holy Cross. He'd been sent to America at the ripe age of 28 with $300 in his pocket. And they said, go start a religious order, start a congregation in the United States. So in 1842, he opened up a little French boarding school, and he got 3 interesting early pictures here. Here's the first one. There's the fathers and brothers arriving. That cabin is still there, by the way. Been at Notre Dame, you can still see the original cabin that they used. He started that Notre Dame du Lac, it was called back in those days, in the wilds of Indiana. No one knew what was going to happen in this little French school here, but as the head of this school, Father Sorin would send 8 priests to render civil aid to the Civil War soldiers. 7 became chaplains, and he would influence over 60 nuns from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, their female equivalent, to serve as nurses. No other Catholic institution in America, and not even the Jesuits, God bless them, who had 18 chaplains. No one matched the people that Notre Dame sent to the Civil War to make a difference. They truly were the first fighting Irish. Okay, so to understand what Bishop Ireland said about Father Sorin saving the honor of the church, we got to talk about that a little bit here. The story of Notre Dame and the story of Holy Cross and all the chaplains and Catholic immigrants in the country, of course, begins in the troublesome 18th, 19th century, a time of a lot of suspicion, mistrust, and prejudice of Catholicism at the time. The mid-19th century was marked with that too. America had been founded, as probably most of you know, by Calvinists, okay, who came out of an anti-Catholic bias when they were formed in the first place. They'd broken away from Catholicism. They continued to have antipathy towards Catholics, and memories still fresh in America's minds of a lot of Catholic events. We won't go through them. I just put a couple up here. One of the most famous anti-Catholic incidents, two of them, was this one right here, the 1834 mob burning of a convent in Charleston, South Carolina. There's been a bunch of riots. I won't go into the history of it. A bunch of riots at the time. It was a mistaken understanding of what happened there. And a very famous preacher, probably is America's most famous preacher, stirred it up. Lyman Beecher. You heard the famous Beecher family? He stirred it up. He was very anti-Catholic, and it led to the burning of this convent, okay? The other one is a fascinating book, almost semi-pornographic, really. This book called Maria Monk, a legendary book written around 1836 or so, about supposedly the lurid events going on in convents, between convents and priests and tunnels and all the rumors you often hear about crazy Catholics. It's all made up. It was all made up by a bunch of New York people. Maria Monk was actually a prostitute. So the whole story was made up in the first place. This kind of stuff, this was public literature, right? This was out there all over the place. And of course, you've all heard of the Know Nothing Party, right? So the whole era was one of a time. And this affected the Civil War. It was an era of what we call sheep stealing. We pastors, when you try to steal somebody else's congregation, you know, steal their sheep, that's what happened a lot of times with Catholics as well. And that's what happened all throughout the Civil War. A lot of the Protestant chaplains and leaders would try to steal Catholics. And one of the most famous was General Oliver Otis Howard. O.O. Howard, called the One-Armed General. He was a strong Methodist, and he would often try to get Methodist preachers in to convert Catholics away. So that's one whole thing. Second thing, Catholics just simply face challenges being appointed Civil War chaplains in the first place. So in the spring of 1862, and I have some statistic here that kind of lay that out. Spring of 1862, okay, what's going on here is there are about 3,700 wartime chaplains in all, okay? The problem was Protestant officers many times just refused to accept priests as chaplains. So it's very rare for a Catholic to ever chaplain a predominantly Protestant regiment. It was almost the other way around. The opposite occurred all the time. So 1860, early in the war, 3,700 chaplains in all, but there were 121 chaplains. So in all, there's only 121 priests, official and unofficial. And my next book, I'm about 3/4 done, is going to focus on the 121 priests. Fascinating stories on these gentlemen. But in that year, in 1862, there's actually the ratio. There's only 22 priests serving among 472 Union chaplains on duty, which is a ratio of 1 to 21, when the ratio of Catholics to Protestants, as I indicate here, was 1 to 9. So you can see the disparity in numbers here too. Catholic chaplains were usually chosen only for regiments that were predominantly Catholic. And I put a few down here for you. In the South, that would have been the 10th Tennessee for regiments out of the area around Nashville, Tennessee, and 3 Louisiana regiments. Louisiana, of course, a very mixed city. And we could talk forever about my favorite chaplain down there, Father Sorin, the 14th Louisiana. Those are about the only ones. But in the North, you had a lot of famous ones. Everybody's heard of the Irish Brigade? We're going to hear more about them in a few moments here. Corcoran's Irish Legion. Chicago had 2 predominantly Irish regiments. I don't know if you know, have you heard of the 23rd Illinois and the 90th Illinois? So both of them were predominantly Catholic regiments. So there's a number of them around the area. Now that brings us back to Father Sorin, okay, and little old Notre Dame. 1861, this Notre Dame campus, if you can call that, only had 213 students, only 13 priests. It had already had a fire which practically destroyed whatever they had. It had debt. It had all kinds of issues. It's basically by then just a French boarding school. Had a couple different kinds of schools, had a prep school, had a college, had a manual labor school and a seminary. The Girls' Academy, actually across the street, still there, was actually much larger. It had 200 nuns at the time, about that time, St. Mary's College. So in 1861, Father Sorin was convinced, like a lot of people, the war wouldn't last very long, right? Wasn't that the predominant thought? It won't last very long, it'll be real quick. So he didn't assign any troops at all because he didn't think it would last very long. However, the local bishop, at the behest of the governor, Governor Morton, at the end of June of 1861, he said, I got to send somebody. And so, thus, the first chaplain got sent, Father Paul Gillen. Father Gillen. Father Gillen was 51 years old at the time, old for a chaplain, very wiry Irishman. Doug talked about immigrants. Well, that's true of the clergy as well. The predominant number of clergy were immigrants as well, and Father Gillen was as well. He had actually been what we call a late vocation. He had actually had a job before he became a priest. He was actually a newspaper agent out in Boston, working for a group called the Boston Globe. But Father Corby, Father Sorin sent him to Washington, D.C. He was actually already there, working on behalf of the institution of the Notre Dame. That was the headquarters, of course, of the Army. While he was in Washington, he discovered that the Irish Brigade was starting to move forward under General Marr, and they'd already left New York to go to the front. So Gillen followed them along, and he overtook one regiment, the 22nd New York Volunteers, just before First Bull Run. So he heard confessions all night long, common thing before battle. If you're going into battle, you want to make sure you have everything on your side, right, including no sins. So a lot of priests heard confessions for many, many hours all through the night. His work wasn't even done when the troops were ordered into battle. So he gave a quick general absolution. We'll talk more about that. About Corby gave the famous one, but that was actually far more common in the war, general absolution. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Catholic have confession, where you confess your sins to a priest. It's supposed to be one-on-one. But in times of death or a disaster, the priest is empowered to give absolution to everybody. I could forgive everybody's sins in the room. And that's what happened before battle. Does that make sense? So we can talk more about that later on if you want to. So Gillen went forward with battle with them, and of course we all know the result of what happened with First Bull Run as they, of course, retreated back to Washington. So that ended the first foray of Notre Dame into the battle, a very tumultuous, obviously, beginning. Now, Father Gillen was an amazing soldier in many ways. He stayed with his troops for 4 years, and this guy was already, I know 51 doesn't seem old today, but to be on the ground, living on the ground as the soldiers were, eating that same food, that's tough. He was with them for 4 years without any sick break at all, which is nearly miraculous. And he was not a young man at the time. He was never incapacitated. At first, he said, I don't want any commission with any regiment. I want to roam. Just let me go. Let me wander around and do what I need to do. So he didn't want an officer's commission. So he rigged up this fascinating creature. There's no picture of it. He rigged up this contraption of a horse-drawn buggy in which he carried all of his supplies. And he could convert this buggy with a little trailer behind it, convert it to a sleeping compartment or a restaurant or a chapel. And he would go from regiment to regiment with this crazy contraption that he would sleep in and eat out of and do mass in and all this good stuff along all over the place. He would drive all around. He did that for quite a while, administering the sacraments, giving comfort to the soldiers. But later on, he ran into trouble from General Grant. Grant put an order out about civilians and unauthorized vehicles. In fact, Gillen was arrested at one point in time because he was stubborn, so they actually arrested him. So he gave in, and he finally accepted a commission as I said, chaplain of the 170th New York, and he got two interesting pictures. Here's a Matthew Brady of the 170th, and there's part of the famous Corcoran Irish Legion here. He continued his work till the end of the war, and the soldiers were amazed at this guy. His energy was just boundless. Corby says in his book, in his memoirs, which we'll talk about, Gillen could do double the work, endure twice as much as any younger chaplains, and do more today than anybody else. So he's just a stunning guy with his work. One general, John Reynolds, saw Gillen one time walking behind the lines. This is just after the battle had happened. He's actually walking in between the lines, helping prisoners. And John Reynolds said, quote, he's the damnedest venturesome old clergyman I've ever seen in my life, okay? Gillen returned to Notre Dame after the war and died at age 72 in 1882. So now, following First Bull Run, another Holy Cross priest was sent to help out, Father James Dillon. Now, he again was already in East helping out, and he was sent to the legendary Irish Brigade. But Dillon got there and he said, man, this is too much work. This is 3,000 soldiers here in 3 regiments. He says, I can't handle this by myself. He wrote to Sorin and says, you got to send somebody else. And so thus it was that probably the most well-known chaplain of all was sent, William Corby. So this is the 2 famous chaplains, the 2 Irishmen, James Dillon and William Corby. Now Dillon, 28 years old at the time here, an Irishman, again, another native Irishman, a lot of enthusiasm, ready talker. He was big into temperance issues. You know, I've heard rumors Irish have a little trouble with drinking. You've heard that, haven't you? So he was very big. We'll see a picture of a temperance medal that he created a little later on in the sides there. He became chaplain of Corcoran's Irish Legion as well, the 63rd New York at the time. He was a very ardent man, very impulsive, very eloquent, and this was seen at Malvern Hill. July 1st, 1862, the chain of command at Malvern Hill broke down in the Union Army here, and the troops were all wandering, all disrupted. So Dillon himself took control, and he acted as an officer. He literally shouted orders to the troops, rallied the troops, marched them, and led them on until he found himself relieved by his superior officer. So he was not afraid to jump in like sometimes young men are. However, unlike Father Gillen, Dillon's health was a lot more delicate. And the toughness of camp life, which affected a lot of the soldiers, affected the clergy, and it really exacerbated some lung troubles that he had. So here is James Dillon right here. This is actually his brother, Patrick Dillon, who was a Holy Cross as well. He never went into battle. Here, of course, is Corby, who we don't know who those other chaplains are. Those are 9th Corps. The title on this picture is 9th Corps chaplains, but nobody seems to know who these other 2 are here anyway. So Dillon, unfortunately, went back to Notre Dame. Community couldn't really help him. He died at the early age of 37 years old in 1870. A lot of it due to the lung problems that he had picked up during the war. And in my research on chaplains, I find that over and over again. Their death was exacerbated by what they went through in the war, the lung issues and all the other stuff that went on. And now when you hear about chaplains, of course, in the Civil War, if you know anything about the topic, the one name that comes to mind is Corby, William Corby. And here he is here. This is partly because he became so famous after the war, okay? And of course, having a comrade promote your cause doesn't hurt. He had an officer of the 116th Pennsylvania, General St. Clair Mulholland, promote his cause for a Medal of Honor, which he didn't get. But anyway, it doesn't hurt to have also what doesn't come up here, have a statue dedicated to you, which we'll see in a little second here too. But he was a rare man, unique man in many, many, many ways. He had this rare combination of stamina and courage and wisdom and prudence. He was a great writer, a great speaker, and he had a long and profound and lasting influence on the men of the 88th New York Brigade and the Irish Brigade in general. He has a great quote, and I love this quote. I put it in here. This really sums up a lot. A lot of chaplains were ignored and laughed at by the troops, especially early in the war. They were clergymen that didn't know the troops and stuff like that. And the ones that lasted had this unique quality. Here's what Corby writes in his book. He says, in the wartime army, courage is the currency with which men's hearts are purchased. And the chaplains who could be courageous and be right out there with the troops are the ones who won the support. So that's Corby. Let's move on here to our next slide here. Corby's first battle is at Fair Oaks, okay, June 1st, 1862. It was a bloody battle, kind of indecisive. It was part of the Peninsula Campaign. 3 priests were captured at that battle, just purely by trivia. They were Union chaplains who were ministering in between the lines, and Confederates moved forward, captured them. I have lots of fascinating stories. It's another book I want to do down the road. They actually wound up living in Richmond. They didn't know what to do with 3 priests. Confederates didn't know. They said, what do we do with 3 priests? You know what they did? They sent him to the Bishop of Richmond, John McGill. So they lived with the bishop for 2 weeks. Also in the bishop's house were 3 Confederate chaplains. Can you imagine what that house must have been like? I would have loved to be in the discussions. That's a fascinating little story about that. So they didn't know what to do, and they sent him to stay with the bishop anyway. So at Fair Oaks, when that battle had finished and everybody had retired with the dead and the wounded, Father Corby was exhausted. He found an old envelope and one stamp, and he simply wrote on the inside of the envelope, he said, "The battle is over and we are safe." And when Sorin got this, he called all the students together and read it to them and told them all about this battle that had happened. Now, the next years were very eventful for Corby, and most of it is detailed in his marvelous book. There are several, only a couple really, really great chaplain's diaries. There's two, really. This is one. The other one is the Confederate chaplain James Sheeran. Marvelous, marvelous book on memoirs of a chaplain's life here. I won't go into detail. He spent 3 years with the Irish Brigade, and you know, if you know the Irish Brigade history, they went through some of the worst battles of all, right? Chancellorsville, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, all those places. He got sick from malaria one time. Father Dillon helped him out. At one point, he's the only Catholic priest in the whole Army of the Potomac. He had to take care of everybody in the Army. He ministered all night long at times, said masses every day. He created a unique mass he describes in his book. We're going to see a quote later on. He called it a military mass. And at this mass, all the soldiers and the officers had come in full dress uniform. And they had the band playing. And they had a beautiful altar, and there's his rustic altar, but he had a beautiful altar in a tent. And he had cannon go off at the high point of the Catholic Mass. If you know the Catholic Mass, at the consecration of the bread and the wine to the body and blood of Jesus is the crucial moment. Can you imagine that, holding it up and the cannon go off? That's what he did. By the way, I'm a reenactor in my former life. I tried that one time down at Manuka. And guess what? The reenactors were very accurate reenacting, because you know what they were doing at the time they were supposed to blow the cannon off? They were drinking. That's why I held it up and waited and waited and waited, and nothing. So I put it down, held up the next one, held up the cup, waited. As I start the Mass, all of a sudden I hear boom, boom. So they were just being good reenactors, reenacting drinking, I guess, at the time. But Corby would do that, and it was a very popular Mass. These were Irish troops primarily. So very popular Mass. Obviously, when they're in camp, when they're on the road, you know, he would come up with something very unique for his altar and things like that. He would administer the pledge. He would write letters. A lot of soldiers were illiterate, right? So the priest, the chaplain, would write the letters for them, and they would, of course, baptize them and anoint them and things like that. A couple of stories, anecdotes about Corby. He had a great sense of humor. And when he was asked many times after the war, you know, what do you do all day? You know, what do chaplains do in the Army? Corby said this. He said, quote, "Chaplains spend time in much the same way as parish priests do, except that we have no little old ladies to bother us and no pew rent to collect." Back in those days, pew rent was a very, very important part. He is most famous of all for what happened right here, and I presume you all know what this is, right? This is day 2 at Gettysburg. This is what put Corby on the map. I know you probably know the story. As the battle at Seminary Ridge on the second day was going back and forth, about 4 p.m., it became clear that the Union was going to have to advance again and going to send in the troops of Caldwell's brigade, the Caldwell's division, including the Irish Brigade under Hancock's 2nd Corps. And they knew, they saw what was happening, and they knew it was going to be deadly. So Corby approached the commander of the Irish Brigade, Colonel Patrick Kelly, and he says, can I speak to the troops? And so he mounted a rock, and mounted on a rock with his stole on, he addressed the troops, told them to be good men, to fight for their wives and their children and their country. And Irish pride was a big thing. Stand up for old Ireland, and don't be afraid as we move forward into the battle. At the end of it, he called them to fall to their knees, and he gave them this famous general absolution in Latin, ego te absolvo, nomine Patri, Filio, et Spiritus Sancto. So he gives us a beautiful blessing, and it was very, very moving. And then, of course, the troops went off into the wheat field, where they actually suffered 198 casualties out of 530. So it was truly a deadly, deadly battle. But this scene was remembered for a long time. Even Hancock, and the guy who wrote this picture, John Hancock, Winfield Scott Hancock, was notoriously profane, swore like a trooper, but he was very touched. You can see a little reference to him. He actually took his hat off. As Corby was doing this, he took his hat off. And he acknowledged that something special was going on. Another general there, General Samuel Zook, said it was the most impressive sight I've ever seen on a battlefield. So this was truly great. Now, again, as I mentioned, general absolution was not new. It was done throughout the war by priests in different ways. What made this one bigger because it's so public. It was such a dramatic occasion. Everybody saw what was going to happen. They knew death was coming as they're going into the next phase of the battle. And of course, it was the circumstances made it very powerful. So this is a painting that is hangs in Notre Dame's gallery, the Snight Gallery, the famous blessing of Corby, which of course is honored by the statue. I would say, you know how paintings get blown out of proportion? Has anybody been to Gettysburg, have been to this place? You can go here and see the rock. The rock is not this big. The rock is about that right there, that rock. I've stood on it, by the way. I actually stood on, there it is right there. I actually stood next to Corby on that rock. So, you know, artists take a little exaggerations in here. But Corby went on to a famous career. There's a late life picture of him. He became president of Notre Dame twice afterwards. He was a superior of the Notre Dame community. He was very prominent socially. And he was the commander of the Grand Army of the Republican Post 569. What's so important about that? It's the only GAR post that was all religious. You had to be a priest or a religious to be part of the GAR post at Notre Dame, and Corby was part of that. Okay, still awake, still with me? All right, let's move on. So we've talked about Gillen, Dillon, Corby, all Irishmen, fighting Irish, fits our topic, right? They all went east because of the strong Catholic Irish Brigade and the Corcoran Legion. But the curious thing is the greatest majority of the Notre Dame religious who contributed to the war didn't go east, they stayed close to home. They served in the West. And I probably could have entitled this talk, the Fighting French instead of the Fighting Irish, because 3 of the 7 Holy Cross priests were French. So let's talk about it. There were 3 of the 7 chaplains were French here. Father Julien Bourget and Zephyrin Leveque. These first 2, there's no pictures of them. Both of them are short-term chaplains, okay? Most chaplains were short-term, meaning not much more than a year, maybe a little bit more than a year. That's what I call short-term. For purposes of my book, my new book I'm calling Full-Time Chaplains 3 years. Basically a steady service throughout that time here. So, and of course, they both became part of the other Civil War statistic. I know you all know that twice as many soldiers died of disease than bullets. And that's exactly what happened here. Both of these priests lost their lives because of sickness. Bourget had been asked by Father Sorin to go down to a Mound City, the Mound City Military Hospital, which the nuns, which we'll talk about in a second, were actually ministering at. He went down there and ministered, but he died of malaria there, along with 2 other nuns, by the way, who also died there as well. Died in June of 1862. Father Leveque was actually a Canadian. He was a member of the Quebec Diocese, and he joined the Notre Dame Order, and he was an older man, a little older man, very zealous, wanted to serve, but he was also very sickly. And what happened to him exactly is kind of lost in history. We know he went out east. We think he served with the 12th New York Militia. That seems to be what the fact was. But he too died in a state of exhaustion in February of 1862 down there. The other man that's fascinating is Father Joseph Celestine Carrier. Now, he's a fascinating story. Came to Notre Dame in 1860, and he was a brilliant man. He was a scientist. He loved science, and he was marked by Sorin from day one. He says, "You're my science teacher. I'm setting you out. I'm going to set you, get you every training you need to do a scientific career." However, his studies were interrupted in the spring of 1863 when Sorin got a letter in the mail from a woman he could not ignore. You know who this is, right? William Sherman's wife, okay, Ellen Ewing Sherman. Did you know Ellen Ewing is an off-the-wall Catholic? She is extremely strong Catholic woman, okay? And she had convinced her husband, by the way, Sherman was not practicing. We could spend a whole lot of time talking about that. Sherman was not a practicing Catholic, although his wife did what some wives have done over the years. As he lay on his deathbed, who'd she call? The priest to anoint him. I won't get into the story, but Sherman's son, it's a bit of irony, Sherman never practiced faith. He wasn't opposed to it, he just didn't practice it. His oldest son, you know what happened to him? God got even with him, I hate to say. You know what happened to his oldest son? Became a Jesuit priest. Became a Jesuit priest, Thomas. And Sherman had a very, very hard time. Didn't talk to him for a number of years about it. So anyway, Ellen and Sherman said, we got to do something here. 4 of their 6 children went to Notre Dame. 4 of the 6, okay? Now, Ellen had become quite perturbed because the army is now in Vicksburg, in the midst of the Vicksburg campaign. She had 2 brothers in the Union Army, General Hugh and Captain Charles Ewing, and they couldn't go to Mass. She said, well, this can't be. Now, there actually were priests. She didn't know it. I've discovered in my research there was priests down there. She just didn't know it at the time. They were not easily available. And was very, very sick and would die, actually. So she wrote to Father Sorin. She said, you got to send a priest. Well, you don't ignore General Sherman's wife. So who does he send? He sends Father Carrier down there. Okay, so Father Carrier is sent to Vicksburg. He arrives just in Vicksburg in time to see the end of the siege. Just to see the end of it in Vicksburg. And he got a copy of the last paper that came out of Vicksburg, which was printed on wallpaper. The last paper was they were so tight, hard up, they actually did the last paper on old wallpaper down there. He ran into several priests, 2 Confederate chaplains, because when the army surrendered, the Confederates were in the city. Father John Bannon, I should do a talk on him, Doug. He was another fascinating Confederate chaplain out of St. Louis. Father Mignault, one of our Wisconsin priests who will be told, story will hopefully be told here at the museum very soon. And a priest, a Frenchman named Father Henze, who was scared to death. He lived in the basement of the church for 15 days because he was scared of Union shelling. So anyway, Carrier stayed around the city. He was a short-term chaplain, no more than 3 months. But he stayed around, he assisted the Sherman family, and unfortunately, he also had to take care of one very sad event. Do you know what happened to William Sherman's son, Willie? He died, 9 years old, right during the Vicksburg campaign. And so Carrier had to assist and do the service of 9-year-old Willie in October of 1863. It was in Memphis. He also did one more important thing. He wrote a letter to President Lincoln on behalf of the Notre Dame order, asking for their priests and religious to be exempt from the draft. Now, this became a huge issue for Catholic priests and seminarians because they were men, right? And the government thought, hey, they're men, they're military age, they can fight. Well, every religious order had to figure out a way to get exemptions for their priest or the students, and that's what Carrier did. He wrote a letter. He actually went to Washington. He met personally with Lincoln and Stanton. And of course, when you have these 2 behind you, guess what the result was? He got that exemption pretty quickly and pretty easily, thanks to those 2 generals here. So that's the story of Father Carrier. Now, if you're counting, we've come to 6, right? That leads to the 7th Notre Dame chaplain, and maybe the biggest character of them all. Cantankerous, courageous, colorful, Father Peter Paul Cooney. Anybody here know Ed Bars, the great beloved Ed Bars? I had the privilege on a number of the tours I did with Chicago to work with Ed a bunch of times, and he always called me the Padre. And Ed Bars loved Peter Paul Cooney. He would say, Peter Paul Cooney, no man like Peter Paul, brave man, out there in front with his troops. Ed just loved Peter Paul Cooney. So Peter Paul Cooney was another Irishman, yet another one. He had applied for admission to Holy Cross while he was in the Baltimore Seminary. He was ordained 1859, December of 1861. He is appointed chaplain of the 35th, the troops that eventually became the 35th Indiana. There's their flag, and there's a picture of one of the 35th Indiana soldiers. He would go on to be, after Father Gillen, one of the longest serving chaplains of any in the entire war. There's only 15 Catholic chaplains that actually served all of 3 years. Gillen is one, and Corby is another one, and of course Cooney is the other one. He served from October 1861 to July 1865. He's described as feisty. I like that word. Those days they didn't use the word feisty, they called him peppery. He was a peppery man. He was cantankerous. He wanted discipline. He wanted order. He had an inclination to lecture people. Didn't matter if you were an officer, you'd get a lecture. If you were a soldier, you'd get a lecture. But that wasn't what his dominant personality was. He's an extremely generous man, very courageous man, not afraid to go right with the troops, and it made him a legend as the chaplain. Now, when Father Cooney joined, there's no distinctive chaplain's uniform. I won't get into that, but chaplain's uniform was vague. The manual had one. It was basically a frock coat with 9 buttons and a little thing on the side. But a lot of chaplains took liberties. They did what they wanted to. So here's a good example of roughly what the chaplain's formal code was. Well, that wasn't good enough for Cooney. He wanted to dress it to the max. So I thought I would share with you what Cooney does. He designed his own chaplain's uniform. I thought you'd appreciate this. He says, I had gold cords down the side of my pants and gold on my shoulders. I had black velvet, 4 inches long, 2 inches wide, surrounded by gold lace in the shape CN, chaplain, right? And the cross in the center was embroidered with gold thread. Around my head, I wear a gold band with gold tassels. You get the picture here, right? I wear my Roman collar, and there you do see his Roman collar right there. Of course, over here as well with this habit on over there. I wear my Roman collar around my waist. I wear a blue silk sash with tassels. The whole thing makes a very appropriate uniform for a priest. The Bishop of Louisville, Bishop Spalding, was very pleased with it. So even though he may have had a vow of poverty, which he didn't mind dressing it to the hilt here, okay? It seems like even his horse had an attitude, by the way. In Corby's memoirs, quote, he writes, my horse carries his head so high that the other day when I was riding him, he struck me with the back of his head on the nose. So even Cooney's horse. So Corby is a unique man. Now, unlike his Eastern Conference, he didn't get into battle for a while. The 35th Indiana Army, the Cumberland, in 1862 was kind of wandering around Kentucky and Tennessee chasing Confederates, if you know your history. But when 1863 ordered opened, the 35th Indiana was in the heart of it. They were at a place called Stones River. They were right in the heart of the Stones River. This is Father Cooney's first battle experience, and he did himself proud. He was actually written up in the official commander's post-battle report, which is very rare. He mentions the chaplain, and he mentions Cooney. He says, quote, to Father Cooney, our chaplain, too much praise cannot be given. Indifferent as to himself, he was deeply solicitous for the temporal and spiritual welfare of us all. On the field, he was cool and indifferent to danger. In the name of the regiment, I thank him for his kindness and his laborious attention to the dead and to the wounded. Now, Cooney himself wrote this. This is fascinating. He said, every morning before the battle, and then there were 5 days of fighting there, I would come out before the whole regiment drawn up in a line of battle. I'd offer a prayer and then give the men an act of contrition. Had them repeat after me, and I'd give them general absolution while they're all kneeling down. General William Rosecrans, who, by the way, was a Catholic. His brother Sylvester Rosecrans was a bishop in Cincinnati. Rosecrans was so impressed, he ordered all the Protestant chaplains to do the same thing. And Cooney said, what can they do? Because they don't believe in confession. So it was a fascinating story. Now, let's talk for a second about, I've talked about the chaplain. What made a chaplain effective? I mean, there were good chaplains, there were bad chaplains. Although as a rule, Catholic chaplains were generally some of the best. Very dedicated, very devoted people. What made them best? This is what made them best. They were jacks of all trades. The best chaplains of all were those who could do anything and help people with the knot. The jacks, so anything they could do to assist the troops. So certainly people like Cooney, they did the traditional spiritual work, you know. They built the chapel. There's that altar again. They would build a chapel when they needed, you know, organize choirs, say mass, hear confessions. And Cooney heard confessions one night, all night long, and it began to rain. And so you know what the soldiers did? They actually rigged up bayonets in the ground, and now they stick the bayonets upside down, and they put a tarp over it. and rigged a tarp up over Cooney so it'd be out of the rain and hear confession. So the soldiers really took care of Cooney. But the best chaplains went above and beyond the call of duty. They would baptize people. General David Stanley was baptized, a Catholic during the war. They would above and beyond the call. Cooney, one of the things he would do, I've heard of a couple other chaplains doing it, affected the soldiers. So, soldiers got paid, right? We know that. What do you do with money in the middle of Stones River, Tennessee? Nothing. You have no purpose for your money except go to sutlers and waste it. So what a lot of troopers did, they wanted to send it back to their family. How do you get it back to the family? Not exactly a post office right down the corner. Guess what the chaplain would do? The chaplain would take all the money from the regiment, and he would ride and take it to the post office or the postal spot to deliver it. Cooney tells a story in his letter. He wrote a bunch of letters to his brother. And he said one time he took $24,000. Now, Cooney didn't carry a gun, but he says that day, I carried a gun as I took the money to post it for him. He was nearly killed a number of times. In December of 1864, after Nashville, here's what he said: I was standing one time on the battlefield attending a wounded man. I stepped to one side by one step without knowing exactly why I did. Instantly, a cannonball tore up the ground on the very spot I had been standing on 3 seconds before. Nothing but the protecting hand of God could have saved me. And he was later recognized again for gallant service at that battle as well. So as the campaigns, the 35th Indiana, the Army of the Cumberland, if you know your history, was involved in some of the roughest battles. They were involved at places like Chattanooga, Chickamauga, Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, the Atlanta campaign. They were right to the end. Cooney became very worn out. 4 years. It's a long time. He was worn out by fatigue, and he wanted to leave the Army. And his superior gave him permission to do it. But when the men of the 35th Indiana heard about it, they besieged his tent. And they wrote a letter to Sorin. And they said, would you please, moving letter. They came with tears in their eyes saying, you can't leave us. You can't leave us. And so Sorin and Cooney both agreed, and he stayed around right to the bitter end. Cooney, too, would return to Notre Dame, just like Corby, served in a variety of ways. He was a traveling missionary, provincial of the order, charter member of that GAR, and he died in 1905. He was the last of the Notre Dame chaplains to actually die. In 1905, many health issues with his life. His funeral was filled with military honors and was jammed with a lot of people who knew him well. A couple things on here if you're looking. This is a fascinating letter. I don't know if you looked at it. This is what happened to Corby. He got a letter one day from Meade saying, we're going to execute a man. I need somebody to minister to this man. So that's several times in Corby's journal. He talks about ministering to men who are going to be executed. This is a fascinating excerpt. I wanted to show, this is Corby's, watch Corby's phrase. He would say Mass on the Virginia campaign. Look what he said. I celebrated Holy Mass in the tented plain, coram militibus in army, in the midst of the armies on the march. Thus we sanctified another spot in Virginia, as we had done 100 times before, and we continued to do until we reached the end. The children of Israel were conducted by a pillar of fire. The holy sacrifice made us feel we had God with us to guide us. So fascinating little anecdote from Corby about what's going on here. Now, time doesn't permit a fuller development, but to honor the women, I can't go through a talk without talking about the ladies, can I? So we have to have a slide on these great ladies, the nuns of the battlefield. There were 12 religious orders in all that served Civil War troops. Do you all know that there were no trained nurses in America on the eve of the Civil War? Did you know that? The only trained nurses were Catholic nuns. They had training, and many of them had served in other places as nurses. So Catholic nurses were in great demand, okay? In 1860, there were about 200 nuns teaching at Holy Cross. 63 were sent to serve as nurses in 10 different hospitals, beginning in the Western Theater first, Mound City, Memphis, Cairo, Paducah, and then also eventually in Washington, D.C. In fact, by the way, I have to tell you this funny story. After the nuns had come in, the surgeons wanted the nuns. and including the surgeon General Lew Wallace's army at Mound City. General John Brinton told General Lew Wallace, "You get the nuns. I don't want those other women. They're old hags." He says, "Send me the nuns." So they were extremely popular, and most famously, they served on the very first hospital ship in America's history, the Red Rover. And you see a picture there, right down there, the first hospital ship in America, the first traveling nurses were Catholic nuns, Notre Dame nuns who served on that thing. So not to be outdone by Father Corby, who has a statue. Guess who else has a statue, ladies? You'll be proud to know. The nuns do. Probably didn't know that, did you? The Catholic nuns have a statue in Washington, D.C. If you count them, there's 12 different religious orders represented there, representing the 12 different orders that the nuns, it's called the Nuns of the Battlefield. Now, we could go on. I could tell you a lot of stories about the glowing references. And if you want to tell them some more, I can tell you some. But let me just read this one comment from a Confederate soldier. Confederates especially, because a lot of them had no contact with Catholics. And they came in with a lot of prejudices. And they say, "Who are these women?" And they find out they're nuns that just blew their minds. So here's what one soldier wrote. "Without doubt, many of the soldiers who were brought to the hospitals laid eyes for the first time on women garbed in the habit of a religious. Some were simply curious. Others were hostile. There's not a single instance recorded by the sisters where that hostility persisted. When it came time to die, hundreds of non-Catholic soldiers whispered, 'I want to die as a Catholic,' because of those nuns. After the grace of God, nothing but the goodness of the sisters could account for such a change. So salutary was their influence that from a mere natural point of view, General Sherman demanded that the nuns be placed in charge of all the military hospitals under his command." So in the end, 600 sisters from 12 religious orders, including 63 from Notre Dame, served in the battle, including there's the superior of the religious, Sister Angela Gillespie. Okay? Finally, what lessons do we learn as we begin to draw this to a close? What do we learn from all this thing too? Well, first of all, Notre Dame chaplains are great representations of the work that all the 121 chaplains did. They endured same troubles as the soldiers. They had the tough food. They got sick and died. They had to wrestle with the troubles of battle. They experienced the joys and the challenges. But they even had more nuanced challenges to deal with because of the shortage of priests in those days. So a chaplain to be sent to the army meant a bishop had to give up a healthy priest to serve when immigrants were flocking into the country. Most Civil War chaplains were short-term. They didn't have time to stay around, or they got sick, and those that were there worked for long hours. They continually had to deal with prejudice and bias in the military and the culture and the media and every place they did, but they did their job well. And then one result of the work of the Catholic chaplains, especially the nuns, was the beginning of the breaking down of the barriers of prejudice. We had a lot more to go through yet, but it began to break down the barriers. I love this picture, don't you? This is a period picture. It's supposed to be the Notre Dame chaplains, but I tell you, you can't get rid of the Jesuits. They creep in everywhere. There's a Jesuit crept in. These are actually Irish Brigade chaplains. There's Dillon, there's Carrier, and there's Gillen. This guy is the 8th Notre Dame chaplain. He was appointed, but he left the order and joined the diocese in Indiana, so he did very, very little. But that's just a great picture of what's going on at the time. Secondly, as to the long-term influence, what difference? Did the chaplains make a difference in the war? This is hard to gauge. I mean, how do you gauge the spiritual impact? After the war, these men and women of Notre Dame were especially remembered. They made an impact, and they were deeply appreciated for what they did by their country, for their outspoken defense of the faith, their unselfish work, their enormous influence. One post-war author wrote this. He says, "As the war drew to a close, the chaplains who were then in place, the men who had borne the rigors of the field with their weary troops, seemed to stand higher in the regard of the troops than the average chaplains at the beginning of the war. For some soldiers, maybe more than can ever be known, a chaplain's impact could truly be profound." Now, what about Notre Dame's specific influence? Okay, I would argue even more than my favorite group, the Jesuits, who sent 18. They were the largest by far. In my research, I often say that anytime you turn up a rock, you will find a Jesuit in America. They are all an amazing group of guys. I have a whole talk I do on the Jesuits too. But I argue Notre Dame's influence was more profound than the Jesuits by far in the war. 100 priests, nurses, or students served during the war in some way. Chaplains, nurses, or soldiers. A number of Notre Dame's students became soldiers. One, by the way, fought for the Confederacy. He was actually captured and imprisoned in, of all places, Camp Douglas, right in Chicago, and he survived the war. Okay, he's another Frenchman. Enrollment actually increased during the war. Can you believe it? And 40 students from the South came to be at Notre Dame during the war. One Notre Dame chaplain, as we put down here, one Notre Dame student won the Medal of Honor. Orville Chamberlain at Chickamauga for taking ammunition, bringing ammunition to his troops in the middle of a huge siege there. 13, this is what's fascinating to me, 13 soldiers would join the Notre Dame order because of the chaplains. And I had a funny experience of that when I was writing this book. Both prayed to the same God about 10 years ago. I was at Notre Dame. I mean, where do you write a book like this at, except at Notre Dame, right? So I was at Notre Dame. I thought, I got to go out to the cemetery. I got to see these graves of these great guys. And I see the graves of Cooney and these guys, and I see like 10 other Civil War graves. And I said, what the heck are these guys? And I found out these were soldiers who were so moved by Notre Dame, they became Notre Dame religious brothers. So 13 people were so motivated, they joined the order and they're buried. In fact, you see in this picture right there, there's Cooney, there's Corby, that may be Carrier, I'm not sure. The rest of these guys, I think, are all brothers. All brothers. That's part of the GAR, that's that famous GAR post 569 of Notre Dame history there too. So one Notre Dame president would go on to speak of the war and Notre Dame's commitment, saying the peaks of Notre Dame are shrouded in war. So folks, in conclusion, next time you turn on your TV, this fall, when you turn on and watch these guys come on the field with green and gold or silver and gold, whatever they wear, to charge and play Navy or play Michigan, okay? I simply ask you this one thing, and remember the original warriors of Notre Dame, okay? The original people, Corby at Gettysburg, Cooney at Stones River, Dillon at Malvern Hill, Sisters Veronica and Adela on the Red Rover. So long before these three guys, you all know who they are, right? Rockney, the Gipper, win one for the Gipper. There's the Gipper. And of course, you know that guy, Joe Theismann. Long before these three guys, you had these three, those four, those seven. You had Cooney, Corby, all these beautiful men, the nuns of the Civil War. They truly are the ones who were a family of faith. They were the heroes of the battlefield, the first domers. They were the original fighting Irish and fighting Frenchmen of Notre Dame. Thank you for your patience today.